we'll show our viewers that clip, and then we'll come back. But it's October 1980 debate with Jimmy Carter, and we'll get to it here in just a minute. My apologies, it wasn't ready to go, and I tried to push the envelope there, so my apologies. Let's keep talking though about your book. You spoke to Carter
I interviewed
for
President
this book.
Carter.
What did he tell you?
It was absolutely fascinating interview. I was surprised that he would agree to an interview. I sent him a letter, and I expected a perfunctory no. And within a matter of days, I get a call from his office saying, "Would you like to interview the president?" I said, "I'd love to." So I thought about how I was going to make arrangements to fly down to Georgia. I said, "No, tomorrow morning, at 6 a.m. by phone." And so all I had to do was to email a series of questions that I wanted to ask the president. So I emailed them to his secretary, and then I came to my office the next morning, and it was either 6 or 7. I remember it was very early in the morning, and that impressed me that he got up that early. And we went through, we were supposed to talk for half an hour. We ended up talking for about 45 minutes. He was very frank about 1976, about his appeal in '76. He described himself as an odd duck because he was conservative on some issues. He was liberal on other issues. He was conservative on reducing Washington, middle-class tax cut, cleaning up the corruption in Washington, but he was also liberal on human rights, and so that was somewhat of an odd appeal in 1976. It was clear that even 30 years later, you remember Ted Kennedy challenged Jimmy Carter in the primaries, and it was clear that 30 years later that none of the animosity had washed away. That there was still, a resentment on the part of President Carter toward Senator Kennedy for challenging him in the primaries. But he was very factual about it too. The one thing he did note was that when Kennedy challenged Carter in the primaries, it allowed culturally conservative voters, especially Catholics, to think twice about supporting the president in his re-election. And indeed, they, in the fall election, voted for Ronald Reagan. A majority voted for Reagan, but he thinks that because Kennedy's challenge allowed them to be pulled away, that it opened up the opportunity for Reagan to move in after Kennedy had conceded in August of 1980 to take a closer look at Ronald Reagan. And he's probably right about that.
Well, let's go to that moment in October of 1980, a debate between Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter.
Next Tuesday is Election Day. Next Tuesday, all of you will go to the polls, will stand there in the polling place and make a decision. I think when you make that decision, it might be well if you would ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago? Is America as respected throughout the world as it was? And if you answer all of those questions yes, why then I think your choice is very obvious as to who you will vote for. If you don't agree, if you don't think that this course that we've been on for the last 4 years is what you would like to see us follow for the next 4, then I could suggest another choice that you have.
Great, Shirley, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, Greta, I'm glad you showed that. When everybody goes back to the Cleveland debate, they invariably go back to Reagan's quip, "There you go again," which was a funny laugh line at the time, and people in the audience. It was actually the other thing too is that it was the first presidential debate with a live audience. People laughed at the time, but really, what closed the sale with Reagan for the American people is when he looked in the camera and said, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" That's really what crystallized the election. I think right there, that's what Reagan finally won it on. Don't forget is that at the time of this debate, he's behind in the polls to Jimmy Carter. He's ahead in the Electoral College, but he doesn't have nearly the 270 electoral votes he needs, which is why he ended up having to debate Jimmy Carter to make his case, because for the previous several months, his campaign had just been hammered by Carter, and he'd fallen behind in the polls, and so to get himself back in the race, he had to debate.
And what did President Carter tell you about that moment?
The debate itself, he was always raring to go against Reagan, and his aides were divided. Some bought into this notion that Reagan was nothing without his teleprompter, without his 3x5 cards, and that Carter had a record of being a pretty good, tough debater. He debated, obviously, Gerald Ford in 1976 and had done well against the incumbent president. But Carter kind of went back and forth in his diaries. He thought that Reagan was a tough debater, and then other times he said publicly that he thought that he would get the best of his opponent. So there was a great disagreement inside his campaign. When I interviewed Pt2, who was his political pollster, he was dead set against Carter debating Reagan. Not because he didn't think that Carter would win, but because they had the momentum on their side, and that by agreeing to a debate, it would freeze the campaign for a certain number of days, and then the rest of the campaign would be decided or defined by who won the debate, instead of whether or not Reagan was up to the task of being President of the United States.